Hello and welcome to the English Box. Today I'm going to talk about the modal verb must. I have split the lesson into two parts. Part 1 is all about must as a modal verb of obligation, and part 2 is all about must as a modal verb of deduction. It is important to distinguish between these two forms because must as an obligation and must as a deduction have different structures. So let's begin by looking at must as an obligation. Now must is a modal verb, and as you know, modal verbs have special properties. Firstly, we use it with the subject and the infinitive of the following verb. For example, I must do my homework later. There is no S in third person, and in the negative form and in the question form, we do not need to use auxiliary verbs. For example, you mustn't talk in class, and must I come with you to the shops? So let's move on and look at must and have to. What is have to? Well, we can use have to for obligation as well, and they are fairly interchangeable, but there are some minor differences. For example, we tend to use have to more often in conversation than must. This is because must suggests or expresses a stronger sense of obligation. Some teachers also say that using must expresses the fact that the obligation is coming from the person or the speaker, him or herself, and have to is coming from an external source. For example, if I say, I must give up smoking, it means I think I should or must give up smoking. And if I say I have to give up smoking, then it's coming from an external source such as a doctor. The doctor has told me it would be a very good idea to stop smoking. Moving on, must as a modal verb does not have a regular past or future form. This means that to talk about obligation in the past, we have to use had to. For example, I had to give up smoking in the past. I must give up smoking in the present. To talk about obligation in the future, we have three options. We can simply use must, we can use will have to, or we can use be going to have to. For example, I have to give up smoking, I must give up smoking, or I'm going to have to give up smoking. Moving on to the next slide, must and have to in negative. Here it gets a little bit confusing. We use mustn't for prohibition, to say you're not allowed to do something, to say you are prohibited from doing something. For example, you mustn't talk in class. We use the negative form of have to, don't have to express lack of necessity, to say something isn't necessary or needed. You don't have to go shopping if you don't want to, for example. Finally, how do we express this in the past, or how do we express prohibition in the past if we can't use must? Well, here we have two common options or choices. We have couldn't, and we have to be not allowed to do something. For example, I wasn't allowed to eat fast food when I was younger, or I couldn't eat fast food when I was younger because my parents said it was bad for me, for example. Now let's move on to must as a modal verb of deduction. We use must to express a degree of certainty or to express something we believe to be true. For example, you've been working all day. You must be tired. I don't necessarily have any hard physical evidence of this, but I suppose it's very likely that he's tired after a hard day of work. Similarly, there's a man with some dictionaries under his arm. He must be our new Spanish teacher. So I see some evidence and I make an assumption or a supposition. I think it's probable or likely that he is our new Spanish teacher. So let's look at must for deduction in past. Rather than using had to, we have to use must with the present perfect. So let's look at those examples again, but this time in the past. You were working really hard yesterday. You must have been really tired by the end of the day. So must, the modal verb, have been, present perfect. Another example, that man who had the dictionaries under his arm must have been our new Spanish teacher. And finally, ouch, that was a bad tackle. It must have hurt a lot. Again, must, the modal verb, have hurt, the present perfect.